Hi everybody, so it is a real privilege to be speaking with you all today about constructive journalism. And I began working in this space about 5 years ago, and although there were many organizations building their news companies on the principles of constructive journalism, it felt like the conversation was happening in a vacuum, with those practicing it and advocating for it speaking mainly to each other. And so it's amazing to see that it's finally getting a more public platform. So I came into this thing that we now call constructive journalism as a consumer. So I've always been really interested in politics and current affairs, but I began to find the news too depressing. And I actually began to not want to watch the news, and this really worried me, because if I'm a motivated consumer, but I'm attracted to the idea of choosing ignorance, I wondered how many other people felt the same. And I also wondered what would it take to keep me informed in a way that kept me engaged. And since I first asked myself that question, I have become unstoppably passionate about what the answer is, and that's constructive journalism. So rather than switching off because I found the news to be too depressing, I actually began to read more widely to seek out some sort of balance. And in doing so, I was really inspired, and I began a website called whatagoodweek.com, which was a news aggregation of what I considered to be good news stories or solutions-focused news stories. And this wasn't with the aim of nor advocating for a wholly good news newspaper, but it was to provide myself the balance that I felt was lacking. And I was amazed by how many organizations were doing something similar. And I was really keen to learn more about the impact of this type of journalism and the impact that it was having on the reader. So I enrolled in a master's degree in positive psychology to research the psychological impact of the news. And I felt I had to do a master's because it was very difficult to get people outside of the conversation or engaged in the field of constructive journalism to actually listen. And although I had an enormous amount of passion, personal experience, and opinion, it only carried me so far. So for the industry to listen to me and for other consumers to become aware, I had to have something a little bit more substantial that was backed by evidence, science, and statistics. So I began by looking at the negativity bias, and then I looked at the impact of more positive publications, and I've gained a much deeper understanding of the consequence and a much greater respect for the power of the news and the potential of constructive journalism. So I'm going to talk about the reasons for the rise in constructive journalism and some of the people who are currently driving its growth. So as there are many different organizations now practicing constructive journalism, there are a number of different definitions available, but one that I offer for the purpose of this talk so that we're all on the same page is it to be rigorous journalism that seeks to provide a balanced and in-depth understanding of an issue by reporting accurately on both problems and solutions in a way that empowers the reader. So research suggests that the rise in constructive journalism has come about for 3 reasons. Firstly, its rise has been attributed to trying to counteract the negativity bias in the mainstream media, to restore a sense of balance and perspective. And this is similar to my own personal experience. So constructive journalism, or solutions journalism, actually began by addressing this. There was this intuitive sense that there was something lacking in the news narrative. And there was a growing sense that reporting predominantly negative news and sensationalizing negative news was having an adverse effect on the consumer and subsequently the news industry. And this is supported by a growing body of research that shows that this excess of negative news, and it's important to term the word excess, but this excess of negative news can have detrimental psychological impacts on the reader and on society. And these include, but aren't limited to, an inappropriate assessment of risk, where people actually believe the world is more violent and more dangerous than it actually is. And with 24-hour news coverage on television and online, this inescapable sense of risk can lead people to experience anxiety. And a lot of this anxiety is the result of feeling disempowered by what they're actually reading. And it's been identified to leave the reader feeling small, feeling isolated, and feeling powerless. And in psychology, this is known as learned helplessness. So this excess of negativity has also been shown to leave the reader feeling hopeless or pessimistic. And it's no surprise that this results in lower mood levels. So that's on an individual level, but on a societal level, this excess of negativity has been shown to reduce participation as a citizen. And not only due to low levels of self-efficacy or high levels of helplessness, but instead research has shown that it could be fueled by contempt and hostility towards other people, where people are actually motivated not to participate. And finally, it may be through apathy, as people become desensitized to witnessing so much tragedy and disaster, and ultimately it can lead people to entirely disengage from the news altogether. And this negativity bias has been shown to be the biggest reason for audience disengagement, rather than simply because they're not interested. So the first reason for the rise in constructive journalism is to redress this balance. And research is showing that constructive journalism does redress this balance. So by including solutions-focused news into the reader's media diet, and just to slip in a definition of solutions-focused news here, because it is ever so slightly different to constructive journalism. But solutions-focused journalism is rigorous journalism that reports critically on tangible progress being made in order for the reader to learn about how issues are being dealt with. So including solutions-focused news into the reader's media diet, it's been shown to increase levels of optimism, hope, and self-efficacy. So it increases their belief that their actions are able to make a difference. And this is really important in actually mobilizing human behavior, because if you believe that things can get better, and you're empowered to believe that your actions are able to make a difference, this brings about active coping, where people engage better with the problem and are more likely to participate as a citizen in addressing the problems presented, either global or local. So constructive journalism on a more individual level has been shown to improve moods, foster a greater feeling of connection with society, and most importantly for the news industry, it's been shown to lead to greater engagement and higher brand loyalty. So again, I repeat for the last time, the first reason for the rise in constructive journalism has been to redress this balance. But the second reason for its growth has been attributed to the changing role of the journalist in a modern-day media environment. So with the rise of bloggers, social media, citizen journalism, and the affordability of technology, journalists may no longer be the ones breaking the news as before. And in this case, there's an opportunity for the journalist to provide context, verification, and rather than just content, they can help people make sense of the facts being presented. And the third reason for the rise in constructive journalism is that consumers have more choice. And this goes for everything, not just the news. But we are no longer passively consuming what we're provided. We're conscious about the decisions that we make, and we choose how, when, and what to pay attention to. And this increase in consumer demand has given the conversation of solutions-focused journalism more legitimacy. One reason that constructive journalism, and increasingly so in the past, but one reason that constructive journalism has been hindered in its integration into the mainstream media is mainly because of the ambiguity of what it actually is. And this was one of the reasons I wanted to provide a couple of definitions earlier, but it's also been misrepresented in terms of what's actually trying to be achieved. But what's brilliant about the growing movement in constructive journalism is the framework that's being built around it to address this. So we now have definitions, not necessarily uniformed ones, but we do have better reference. And we now have news organizations implementing it. We now have researchers investigating it. We now have education systems teaching it. And we now have enough support to actually mobilize it. So my focus, as I mentioned before, is from the perspective of the consumer and actually why constructive journalism is important. But I'd just like to bring your attention to those working at an industry level about the how of constructive journalism. And there's a growing number of organizations that either implement constructive journalism train others in constructive journalism, or do a combination of both. And this may be old information to some of you, but I think that it's still worth mentioning as they've been so inspirational to the movement and to my personal journey. So one name that I'm sure many of you know and who you're perhaps expecting to see speaking instead of me today, but is Ulrik Hagerup in Denmark, who's implementing constructive journalism through Danish News Broadcasting Corporation. And Ulrik is now forming a platform to show how constructive journalism can work in both electronic and print media. And Ulrik published the first international book of constructive journalism in 2012. And since then, there's been 2 further books published by pioneers in the field. The first of these is Catherine Guildenstern, a Danish news journalist that also did a master's in positive psychology. And she wrote her thesis on innovating journalism through positive psychology, and went on to write a book released last year titled From Mirrors to Movers. And this furthers the tools and techniques for constructive journalism based on 5 main principles of positive psychology. And in Catherine's same year at Penn State University, another woman called Michelle Gielan was also enrolled in a master's in positive psychology. And Michelle's a CBS News anchor in America, and she enrolled to research the impact of constructive journalism on the reader and the industry, and founded Transformative Journalism Initiative. And Michelle's written a manifesto, which is industry-focused about the benefits of constructive journalism to news organizations, and released a book earlier this year titled Broadcasting Happiness. Michelle Gielan also works closely with Arianna Huffington and was influential in building the What's Working section in the Huffington Post. And they continue to work together to research the impact that it's having. And What's Working seems to be a growing mission for their organization. And I'm being able to share my work on their platform, which is great for helping raise consumer awareness about the conversation of constructive journalism. Another organization who I've worked closely with over the years and provided me with access to their readers so I was able to conduct my research is Positive News in the UK. And this is a solutions-focused news magazine. Having been established for 23 years, it's the longest established publication for rigorous reporting on progress and possibility. And last year, it also became a global media cooperative financed through crowdfunding, and is now owned by readers and journalists in 33 countries. And this is a real credit to the brand loyalty, and it shows the value that these consumers place on this type of journalism. Positive News also has a training branch based in the UK called Constructive Journalism Project, founded by Sean Dagan-Wood and Danielle Batiste. And this delivers training and consultancy to help media professionals put constructive journalism into practice. And last year, we delivered constructive journalism workshops to hundreds of students at journalism schools across the UK, as well as training freelance journalists and news organizations internationally. Then there's Solutions Journalism Network in America, and that also runs training and supports research, and it was founded by David Bornstein and Tina Rosenberg, who ran the Fixes column for the New York Times. And they're probably the most advanced in terms of training, as they've built a substantial framework and a toolkit for both the why and the how of solutions-focused news. And they work with many news organizations in the US to implement constructive journalism in their newsroom. And they've also received funding from the Knight Foundation, who are in support of their work. Constructive journalism training has also been undertaken by the European Broadcasting Union, where they're running masterclasses to implement constructive journalism in all 68 public service member TV stations under the leadership of Nicolette Labaudet and Ulrik Hagerup. And more recently, the BBC have announced that it will include training to make sure that constructive journalism becomes a part of their daily work in radio, television, and online. And it's no longer professionals that are only being trained in constructive journalism. As we mentioned earlier, these training workshops are being delivered through universities. And Windensheim School of Journalism in the Netherlands is becoming the first international school of journalism in the world to integrate constructive journalism into its curriculum, with Catherine Guildenstern appointed as the director of constructive journalism. And research continues to grow rapidly in the field. And in 2015, Karen McIntyre became the first person to hold a PhD in constructive journalism. And the researchers into constructive journalism are being brought together later this year at an event in Belgium called the International Constructive Journalism Conference, organized by Brussels Institute of Journalism Studies. And I hope that we may see a few of you there. And there's also a lot of growing support for the field, with influential and well-respected public figures speaking in its favor, like Roland Schatz, Michael Muller, and Martin Lewis. And these are to name a few, but this movement is an accelerating one. And it now has the funding, the resources, the consumer base, and the research to support itself. And the growing field of constructive journalism has helped move the conversation past negative versus positive, problems versus solutions, but it's widened the lens to recognize that both are important. So problems-focused journalism and solutions-focused journalism no longer need to be pitted against each other to decide which is the most important, but instead recognize both in their own right as serving an important informative function in the press. Positive news or solutions-focused news cannot wait to be reported on in the absence of problems. Because if you're waiting for the world to be rid of problems before you start looking at what's working, you're never, ever going to see it. So we do need to notice the world's achievements alongside its failings to better understand and more accurately report on the world. So the research around constructive journalism therefore suggests that news organizations should report on strength as it does weakness, on success as it does failure, on human excellence as it does human corruption and scandal, on solutions as it does problems, and on progress as it does recession. Thank you very much for your time.